Ada Lovelace, mathematician. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Ada who loved machines. She also loved the idea of flying. She studied birds to work out the perfect balance between wing size and body weight. She tested out materials and tried out several designs. She never managed to soar like a bird, but she created a beautiful book full of drawings called Flyology, where she recorded all of her findings. One night, Ada went to a ball. There, she met a grumpy old mathematician named Charles Babbage. Ada was a brilliant mathematician herself, and the two soon became good friends. Charles invited Ada to see a machine he had invented. He called it the difference engine. It could automatically add and subtract numbers. No one had ever done that before. Ada was hooked. What if we built a machine that could make more complicated calculations, she said. Excited, Ada and Charles started working. The machine was huge and it required an enormous steam engine. Ada wanted to go further. What if this machine could play music and show letters as well as numbers? She was describing a computer way before modern computers were invented. Ada wrote the first computer program in history. Alicia Alonso, ballerina. Once upon a time, there was a blind girl who became a great ballerina. Her name was Alicia. Alicia grew up sighted and was already a wonderful ballerina with a great career ahead of her when she fell ill. Her eyesight got worse and worse. She was forced to stay in bed for months without moving. But Alicia had to dance. So she danced in the only way she could. I danced in my mind. Blinded, motionless, flat on my back, I taught myself to dance Giselle. One day, the New York City Ballet's prima ballerina injured herself. They called Alicia to step in. She was already partially blind, but how could she say no? The ballet was Giselle. As soon as she started to dance, the audience fell in love with her. Alicia danced with grace and confidence, even though she could barely see. She trained her partners to be exactly where she needed them at just the right time. Her style was so unique that she was asked to dance with her ballet company all over the world. But her dream was to bring classical ballet to Cuba, her home country. Back from her travels, she started to teach classical ballet to Cuban dancers. She founded the Alicia Alonso Ballet Company, which later became the Ballet Nacional de Cuba. Brenda Chapman, director. Once there was a girl who had curly red hair and loved to draw. Her name was Brenda. When she was 15 years old, Brenda called up Walt Disney Studios. "I'm really good at drawing," she said. "Will you give me a job?" They told her to get back in touch when she was older and had some training. That's exactly what she did. She studied character animation at CalArts, and a few years later found herself exactly where she'd always dreamed, working on animated films for Disney in Los Angeles. She soon discovered that she was one of the very few women animators there. That's when I realized why princesses in their films were so helpless. They had all been created by men, she recalls. She promised herself that she would create a new type of princess. Strong, independent, and brave, she thought. What a great name for a film. Princess Merida in Brave is anything but helpless. She's a fantastic archer and gallops around on her horse, fighting off bears and having amazing adventures. Brenda based the character on her own little girl, Emma, a strong, free-spirited girl just like her mom. She is my Merida, and I adore her. Brenda won an Oscar and a Golden Globe for her film. She also worked on many other award-winning films, like Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, and The Lion King. Brenda became the first woman to direct an animated feature for a major Hollywood studio with Prince of Egypt. Cleopatra, Pharaoh. Once upon a time in ancient Egypt, a pharaoh died and left his kingdom to his 10-year-old son, Ptolemy XIII, and to his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra. The two had such different ideas on how to run the country that soon Cleopatra was kicked out of the palace and a civil war broke out. Julius Caesar, the Emperor of Rome, travelled to Egypt to help Cleopatra and Ptolemy find an agreement. If only I could meet Caesar before my brother does, Cleopatra thought. I could convince him that I'm the better pharaoh. But she had been banished from the palace. The guards would have blocked her at the entrance. Cleopatra asked her servants to roll her up inside a carpet and to smuggle her into Caesar's rooms. Impressed by her daring, Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne. They became a couple and had a son. Cleopatra moved to Rome, but then Caesar was killed, so she went back to Egypt. The new Roman leader, Mark Antony, had heard a lot about this strong Egyptian queen and wanted to meet her. This time she arrived on a golden barge, surrounded by precious jewels and silk. It was love at first sight. Cleopatra and Mark Antony were inseparable. They had 3 children and loved each other to the end of their lives. When Cleopatra died, the empire ended with her. She was the last pharaoh to rule ancient Egypt. Florence Nightingale, nurse. Once upon a time, a baby was born to an English couple travelling in Italy. They decided to name their daughter after the beautiful city where she was born, so they called her Florence. Florence loved travelling, she loved math and science, and she loved collecting information. Whenever she travelled to a new place, she would note down how many people lived there, how many hospitals there were, and how big the city was. She loved numbers. Florence studied nursing and became so good at it that the government sent her to manage a hospital for injured soldiers in Turkey. As soon as she arrived, Florence started collecting and examining all the data she could find. She discovered that most of the soldiers died not because of their wounds, but because of infections and diseases contracted in the hospital. The very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm, she said. She made sure that everyone working there washed their hands frequently and kept everything clean. At night, she carried a lamp as she made her rounds, talking to her patients and giving them hope. Thanks to her, many more soldiers made it home safely, and she became known as the Lady with the Lamp. Jane Goodall, primatologist. Once in England, there was a girl called Jane who loved climbing trees and reading books. Her dream was to go to Africa and spend time with the wild animals there. So, one day, Jane flew to Tanzania with her notebook and binoculars, determined to study real chimpanzees in their natural environment. At first, it was hard to get close to them. The chimpanzees would run away the moment she was in sight. But Jane kept visiting the same place every day at the same time. Eventually, the chimps allowed her to get closer. Getting closer was not enough for Jane. She wanted to become friends with them. So she started a banana club. Whenever she visited the chimpanzees, she would share bananas with them. At the time, little was known about chimpanzees. Some scientists used to observe them from far away using binoculars. Others studied chimps in cages. Jane, instead, spent hours hanging out with chimpanzees. She tried to speak to them using grunts and cries. She climbed the trees and ate the same foods they ate. She discovered that chimpanzees have rituals, that they use tools, and that their language comprises at least 20 different sounds. She even discovered that chimpanzees are not vegetarians. Once, Jane rescued an injured chimpanzee and nursed it back to health. When she released it back into the wild, the chimpanzee turned and gave her a long, loving hug, as if to say, "Thanks and bye." Mae C. Jemison, astronaut and doctor. Once upon a time, there was a curious girl named Mae who could not make up her mind about what she wanted to be when she grew up. Sewing dresses for her Barbie dolls, she wanted to be a fashion designer. Reading a book about space travel, she wanted to be an astronaut. Fixing a broken toy, she thought maybe an engineer would be better. Going to the theatre, she exclaimed, maybe I'll become a dancer. The world was May's laboratory, and she had plenty of experiments she wanted to try. She studied chemical engineering, African American studies, and medicine. She learned to speak Russian, Swahili, and Japanese. She became a doctor and volunteered in Cambodia and Sierra Leone. Then she applied to NASA to become an astronaut. May was selected, and after 1 year of training, she was sent into space on board the space shuttle. She carried out tests on the other members of the crew. Since she was not only an astronaut but also a doctor, her mission was to conduct experiments on things like weightlessness and motion sickness, which can be quite a problem when you're floating upside down in outer space. When May came back to Earth, she realised that, while she had enjoyed space very much, her true passion was improving health in Africa. So she quit NASA and founded a company which uses satellites to do just that. Mae Jemison was the first African American woman in space. Wangari Maathai, activist. Once upon a time in Kenya, there was a woman called Wangari. When lakes started to dry up and streams started to disappear near her village, Wangari knew she had to do something. She called a meeting with some of the other women. The government cut down trees to make room for farms, but now we need to walk for miles to collect firewood, one said. Let's bring the trees back, exclaimed Wangari. How many? They asked. A few million should do it, she replied. A few million? Are you crazy? No nursery is big enough to grow that many. We're not buying them from a nursery. We'll grow them ourselves at home. So Wangari and her friends gathered seeds from the forest and planted them in cans. They watered and looked after them until the plants were about a foot tall. Then they planted the saplings in their backyards. It started with a few women, but, just like a tree sprouting from a tiny seed, the idea spread and grew into a widespread movement. The Green Belt movement expanded beyond Kenyan borders. 40 million trees were planted, and Wangari Maathai was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. She celebrated by planting a tree.